Okay, thanks a lot for having me here. I was actually here at the beginning of the Science of Intelligence in 2019 and saw things in formation, so it's really fun to come back and see all the projects that people are doing. So I know this is a seminar on mind, body, environment, and embodied intelligence. And my sense of that is that, of embodiment in particular, is that we are engaged in action all the time. A lot of our perceptual systems, which is really what I was trained in studying, are the way they are because we have to guide actions in natural environments. We use information that's available in natural environments, and we have to be adapted. Our behavior has to be adapted to operate in those environments. So I think all of those, kind of mind, body, environment, and embodiment is kind of what I like to think about. I'm going to be focusing less on the body, I think, in this talk, and more on the information and how you end up with collective behavior out of the interactions between individuals. But I want to start just thinking a little bit about kind of where we are today. Let me just mention, so this is Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo. Maybe you people have already seen images of this in this seminar, but it's an example of the sort of massive collective behavior that we see not only in animal species, but also in humans, right? So the sort of massive collective motion that happens and interactions between pedestrians that yield these large-scale patterns of behavior. So we're going to get back to that in a moment. But first, I just want to say a few words about where we are at this moment in the study of perception and action. It's kind of a perplexing time that's going on with the development of several different kinds of things at once. So in the last, decade or so, we've seen the resurgence of a lot of assumptions about prior knowledge that the brain and the body are endowed with. Speaking about vision in particular, vision is usually still posed as an ill-posed problem, a problem that can't be solved just on the basis of the visual information that's available. The image information is believed to be insufficient, and so we have to introduce all kinds of world knowledge in order to interpret those images and make sense of them, very much in a Helmholtzian tradition. So there are Bayesian internal models of the world that we use in order to interpret the input and actually perceive something. Friston has a lot of theories about generative world models that are involved in making inferences about what must be out there. My current pet peeve is in order to perceive physical events, we assume there's a physics engine in the brain that can simulate, multi-element simulations of fluids or something, right, in order to perceive water. So there's this kind of free positing of lots of a priori knowledge that the biological system must have in order to do anything, right? See the world and act in the world successfully. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have at the same time the sort of amazing success of the sort of a posteriori learning, right, from deep learning systems. So here's a kind of classical feed-forward CNN that does supervised learning of image classification with these hierarchies of cells, just networks with layer upon layer upon layer of connections. And the success of this is surprising, right? So these systems have been able to classify images and handwriting and all these things that have been impossible to solve, both in computer vision and in theories of human vision and biological vision for a century, and now they're just massively successful, right? And so you could think about that as being evidence that there is indeed sufficient information in images in order to interpret them, right? That we don't need to have a lot of a priori knowledge in order to classify images. There's plenty of information in those images to do so. They're hard to interpret, however, once you've trained a network, right? Trying to interpret what's going on in the network is hard. And this is a graph from my colleague Thomas Serre at Brown, who does neural network models of of biological vision systems. So there's this astonishing success at object classification. So this is the ImageNet labeling accuracy, over the last decade or so, right? And the accuracies now are getting close to 100%, right? Human accuracy is around 94 to 96% at image classification. And these networks are now surpassing human performance, right, at recognizing objects from images. And yet at the same time, the alignment with the diagnostic features that humans use, right, to recognize objects is getting worse, okay? So as the networks improved, that alignment got better. They were more kind of increasing agreement with the features that humans used. And then as the networks got really sophisticated, that alignment began to fall off. So whatever these networks are doing, and it's still hard to know what they're doing, it's not the same thing that humans are doing, and there are similar measures of kind of brain score, right, in terms of the neural responses in infratemporal cortex corresponding to these kinds of images, also is falling off, right, with respect to interpreting what's the internal structure of a neural network. And this is, as we get into transformers and, more sophisticated supervised and self-supervised networks, it's looking less and less like biological vision, okay? So there's something weird going on here. It looks like the networks have an overdependence on textures, for example, and ignore a lot of other kinds of visual information that biological vision uses. This is also just true for the task of image classification, right? So there's no action involved here. There's no interaction with a world. There's no embodiment in these networks. And so maybe that is something that is driving this sort of misalignment between the networks and human vision. So, on the one hand, there's a lot of assumptions about internal structure. On the other hand, there's demonstrations that image structure is really quite plentiful. And one of my favorite examples of this is, rather than looking at deep CNNs, there's some work on self-supervised autoencoders, which is basically just an image compression method, where you've got an input layer and you're forcing that network to go through a small bottleneck in which there's a latent space that encodes properties of the images, and these networks are trained just to reproduce the image, right, to reconstruct the image that is input to it. So it's a self-supervised kind of learning. And this latent space ends up encoding pretty abstract properties of the image, not just these sort of texture features that CNN seem to encode. Roland Fleming and colleagues did this really interesting paper about training these autoencoders on a space of what they called bump world. These are images that varied in things like their shininess or glossiness, the lighting conditions, the direction of lighting, the depth of the relief in these images. So all those things were randomly varying in this sort of 2,000 dimensional space. And they trained an autoencoder on that image set and then looked at the latent space. And the latent space actually broke out pretty consistently properties that were involved in generating those images. So the glossiness or shininess is captured, for example, by these are an indication of a high dimensionalist 10-dimensional latent space. There are these clusters in the latent space that correspond to very glossy images and other clusters that correspond to very low gloss images. So it's recovering the information not just for dogs and cats, but for all kinds of properties of natural surfaces. And if you then look at human judgments of the glossiness of these images on the y-axis here, and try to predict them with the model's distance from the boundary between glossy, high gloss, and low gloss, the correlation is really high, right? So you look at the human's feature alignment here is also pretty good. So we are using the same kinds of properties that the autoencoder is recovering from these images. So there's another way of thinking about this as maybe a model for how the visual system gets tuned to more abstract properties of natural images. So there's a demonstration again of the sufficiency of information in images, even for things as abstract as relief and glossiness and lighting conditions. But we still don't know what the information is, right? We know that the network can recover it, but trying to do neurophysiology on these networks and figuring out the information that's actually encoded it's a black box, right? It's very hard to do that interpretation. So I want to kind of make the case that if we're going to have a science of perception and perception in action, we have to have an understanding of the information in natural images and natural scenes. It's not enough just to train a network to show that they can be learned, and then QED, that's a model for the visual system. We don't know, right? Unless we actually unless we analyze what that information is and test its effectiveness in humans, we won't have a theory of vision and the control of action. So that's the kind of argument I want to make today. And I want to make a case for James Gibson's information hypothesis, in which he basically said for every perceivable property of the environment, however subtle, glossiness or lighting conditions, there must be a variable of information, however complex, that corresponds to it. And that's our job as people studying perception, to figure out what those properties of stimulation are and what that information is. So by information, Gibson meant, it could be very complex, right? It could be higher order spatiotemporal variables of stimulation. They have to be specific, maybe not just to any old physical property, but at least specific to the behaviorally relevant properties of the environment that animals use and humans use to guide our actions. And they correspond to those environmental properties by virtue of physical laws, like the laws of optics or acoustics, but also by ecological laws, by the constraints that exist in a natural environment that structures the information, that structures the light in the environment in which we evolved. So the promise here, in my view, right, what I argue for is that maybe vision is actually a well-posed problem if you think about it in terms of the ecological constraints on natural vision and natural information. But we have to then drill down and say, okay, what is the information? If we're going to cash out on this idea, what is the information that's available in those natural environments? And then how is it actually used to control behavior? Is it sufficient to guide adaptive behavior in natural environments? So I'm now going to pivot and try to say that 20 years ago, I decided I was going to try to figure out a case study. And the case study was the visual control of locomotion, and try to really understand how we guide locomotion in a complex dynamic environment like this one. This is a street level view of Shibuya Crossing. And you see all these complicated interactions that are going on that generate those global patterns of the collective motion and the lane formation that happens as pedestrians are crossing the street. So what are those? What's the information that guides these local interactions? How do we characterize that? How does it guide behavior? And we can try to break down, right, decompose this complex scene that we just saw. And maybe I'll try to run that again. Did I do that? Yeah. So there are things like I'm trying to get across the street, so I'm trying to get to that goal over there. I'm avoiding obstacles along the way. I'm avoiding collisions with other moving pedestrians coming the other way. I'm following this guy in the blue jacket through the crowd. So there's all these local interactions with different informational variables that I'm using in order to guide my behavior through that, but guide my locomotion through that scene. Now, the standard way of thinking about this is, okay, I build a world model. I understand how the physics of other pedestrians and other moving objects works. I take my camera input, I do a complete reconstruction of that 3D world. I did the dynamic 3D world, and then I can make a plan. I can plan a path right through this complex changing scene. And I'm going to argue for something different from that. I'm going to suggest if we understand the information that's available and how that unfolds over time, we can just control our behavior in kind of an online way, right? Here comes an obstacle, I'm going to respond to that. There are 3 obstacles over here, I'm going to respond to that. And my trajectory then evolves over time, emerges from these local interactions that are being guided by the information. So there's, the hypothesis here is there's very little path planning involved. It's all emergent paths that are a result of my dynamic interactions with the local environment. Okay, so the game plan now is we're going to look at some of these elementary behaviors and try to model them, right? And then see if we can build up from these local interactions to explain how we got that collective motion through Shibuya Crossing. So when I talk about this online control and emergent trajectories, it sounds a little vague. So let me just try to specify that in a little more detail. So this is my big picture slide, right? If we think about an individual, an agent moving around in an environment, and there's the environment, we can think of these as a pair of coupled dynamical systems, okay? So here's the agent. The change of state in my action system is some function of the current state of my action system and the incoming information. I produce some action which generates a force in the environment. That changes the state of the environment, which produces information. It might be visual information, it might be haptic information as I feel around for objects. And then that information gets used to regulate my next move, right, my next action. And so for every task that we're doing, we might have a set of control laws that are mapping information into this little dynamical system and modulating the dynamics. So out of this sort of ongoing cycle, we get stable behavior of some kind, right? So the idea is that the second level of analysis, there might be some stable behavior with an attractor in this higher level state space. And as I'm using this information, okay, that allows me to discover these stable solutions, and then those stable solutions feed back to capture my laws of control. So I learn mechanisms for how to do certain kinds of tasks as I'm moving around in the environment. So the idea is that the behavior here corresponds to solutions of the system's dynamics. It might be attractors, repellers, bifurcations in the dynamics. So a locomotor trajectory might be the result of following an attractor around through this evolving scene. The role of information then is to modulate those dynamics in such a way that you get out adaptive behavior. And so the trajectories that we're talking about, these locomotor trajectories, will emerge online without having to do any planning. It's an emergent result of this dynamical interaction. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions if people have questions, or you can just save them up, for the last half hour. Okay, so what do we do when we want to study this, right? So I'm a cognitive scientist by training. I started out studying perception and motor control. We want to take this into the laboratory and try to figure out how to manipulate things to see if we can identify these control processes for locomotion. So we want to take those tasks that I just mentioned from Shibuya Crossing into the lab, study locomotor behavior and these pedestrian interactions, kind of broken down into those tasks. We want to model each one as a simple dynamical system, much on the model of what I showed you in the last slide. And then the bet is that if we combine these simple dynamics, right, for individual behaviors, we combine them, we might be able to predict more complex behavior and eventually get to collective behavior like Shibuya Crossing, and then test that against real crowd data, right, that we collect out in the natural world. Okay, so to do this, we've been doing a lot of work in VR. So our basic paradigm is to have somebody walking around in a virtual environment. We can present anything we want in that environment, break the laws of physics and optics if we need to test our theories. And then we track, basically we're doing head tracking in these experiments, so we track the trajectory of the subject as they're walking around in this virtual environment. The kinds of information that I'm talking about might just start with a basic idea of optic flow. Optic flow is the motion pattern that's produced when you move through the world. So when your eye moves through the world, or when a camera on a robot or a drone moves through the world, right, it generates these kinds of motion patterns that are very systematic. So if, for example, I'm heading toward this point on the runway, coming in for a landing, the motion of the surrounding area will flow outward from my landing point. Okay, so this is known as the focus of expansion. That's my current heading, and this information will tell me where I'm heading with respect to all of these other objects in the scene. It's more complicated than that, of course, and we can go into more depth if you're interested. But out of these optic flow patterns, for humans, just looking at these patterns on a screen, people are able to judge their direction of self-motion within 1 degree of visual angle. That's about your thumbnail width at arm's length. So I'm very good at seeing where I'm headed in the world. This is a visualization of that. So as we create a virtual environment and have someone walk toward this doorway, there's all this motion that's flowing outward from the target and corresponding to my gait, of course. And that that allows me to see where I'm headed with respect to the objects in the scene. Okay. So now we want to try to build up these little dynamical systems that are based on information, right, that will tell me how to behave in order to, say, steer toward a goal. So I just want to give you a flavor of this. This is kind of the beginnings of this project with Brett Fajan. And the basic idea is just take something as simple as steering toward a goal. you can kind of think of this here. I'm heading in this direction, and my optic flow is telling me that's my current direction of heading. I want to be steering toward a goal. What do I need to do? Well, I need to shift my heading point over onto the direction of the goal. And you can imagine that as kind of being driven by a damped spring, okay? So if I'm missing the goal, that angle is going to be closed by a damped spring. And so that's going to create an attractor where my heading error is 0 with respect to the goal, and I'll be pulled to that 0 point, whatever my initial conditions are. So I'm canceling that heading error in order to steer toward the goal. That's fairly simple. You can write it as an equation. So this is just basically an angular mass spring equation. But it works pretty well. So here's the human data from people walking toward a goal that's in different positions. Here's the paths the model generates to heading toward those goals. And there's a high correlation in the time series of these trajectories, which is very high, right? So R-squared is of 0.98. So it's a good description, okay, of how people are generating these paths. Now let's do the opposite, right? What if it's not a goal but an obstacle that you're trying to avoid? Well, now you can just kind of flip the sign on the spring. So now it's pushing your heading direction away from the obstacle because you don't want to run into it. So you want to increase that heading error. So you can write a little repulsion function for the spring that is now, this positive sloping line is a repeller in the goal direction. And so it's going to push you away from that goal direction, but then you don't want to keep spinning around, so it's going to decay back to 0, right, after you're bypassing the goal. So the obstacle is now behaving as a repeller of your heading. And you can write the equation for that. And here's human data with 3 obstacle positions, avoiding those obstacles, and the model generates very similar trajectories, and the time series are also very highly correlated. So we can have a good description of these sorts of trajectories that are being generated based on these pretty simple little mass spring systems. So the idea is now if we want to move through a more complex scene, we just start putting these things together. So what if there are like 3 obstacles or a dozen obstacles? Can I predict the trajectory that people are going to take through that complex scene? And we did this, I don't have a slide for this, but we did this with a field of a dozen obstacles, right? And the model generated paths that were correct. On average, we got half an obstacle wrong, okay, out of 12. So it's kind of a branching bifurcation problem. So it's like if you make a little error here, you're then sent off down the garden path. But nonetheless, the model is pretty good at recovering and or predicting the trajectories that people will take through those complex scenes. Okay, but we're talking about a dynamic world now, right? So we want to start thinking about things like this, collision avoidance with multiple moving obstacles all the time. So I'm going to talk about 3 problems, this collision avoidance problem. There's a following problem, how do I follow somebody else through the scene? And then how does that lead us to account for collective motion and other kinds of collective behavior? So just think about the collision avoidance problem. We'll just play it again, right? I'm walking down the street. There are all these multiple moving objects. How do I pick a path, right, that's not going to collide with any of them? The best account of that, right, is in robotics at the moment, is the reciprocal velocity obstacles algorithm by Vandenberg et al. And so basically, here you've got an agent, here's an obstacle, and so the agent is extrapolating the trajectory of the obstacle in velocity space, and then trying to evaluate all the possible trajectories the agent could take, and picking a solution that is outside the collision zone, okay, with the obstacle. So it requires several things. It requires that the agent be able to see the trajectory of this obstacle in 3 space, which we can't do very well. So we call that an omniscient model because it assumes knowledge of the positions and velocities of the objects in the world. And it doesn't scale very well, right? So now take the scene we just saw walking down the street. So now you've got multiple moving obstacles, and you've got to have knowledge of the motions of all of those obstacles, even the ones you can't completely see. And you've got to compute all of their trajectories, right, and figure out the velocity space. So it blows up, right, as you have more and more obstacles. So I just don't think of this as a biologically plausible solution. It might be fine for robotics, right, but it's not going to work for humans or other animals. So how do we avoid collision? So let's start with one collision. And to avoid one collision, I want to start by talking about interception. Okay. So suppose this is a boat, okay, on the water, and you are trying to intercept the boat. Okay. The rule of thumb in sailing is, keep the boat at a constant bearing direction, a constant compass bearing in space, and you will collide with that boat. Okay. So if you want to intercept this moving target, you want to walk in such a way that that target remains at a constant bearing direction in space as you move through the world. Okay, that's this little psi variable there. So here's the interception path that results if you keep the bearing direction of the target constant. And you basically end up on you make a turn and end up on a straight path that's going to intercept the target ahead of its current position. Okay, here's the time series of that angle between you and the target. So you want to adopt that constant bearing strategy if you're trying to intercept the target. Okay, one way of doing that is to cancel change in the target's bearing direction. Okay, so you keep that constant by canceling its change. And so if you write a little model that does that, that's the dashed line here, it generates trajectories that are very similar to the human data that we find when we're intercepting moving targets. So it's a lot of evidence that people use this constant bearing strategy. Animals do too. So here's a dragonfly intercepting its prey, and it keeps the bearing direction with respect to the horizon of that prey constant as it zeroes in on the prey. So here's that constant bearing solution. Here's another angle that's changing. It's not using that variable. So dragonflies do this, bats do this when they're hunting prey, falcons do this when they're catching prey. So the constant bearing strategy seems to be a pretty ubiquitous solution for chasing a moving target. And it works even if the target's changing its velocity, right? You just keep adjusting so it's adaptive. So now think about collision avoidance. So if I want to avoid a collision, I want to avoid a constant bearing. Okay, I want to turn away from that potential collision point. And so people do this by, avoiding the constant bearing so that we want to keep the change in that angle not equal to zero. We want it to either get bigger or smaller. And so if you can steer ahead of the moving obstacle toward the goal, or you can go behind the moving obstacle, as here, and get to the goal, with a different solution for the rate of change in that bearing angle. And so this is a potential collision avoidance mechanism. Let me just unpack that a little bit because I want to talk about the information that's being used here, right? So if you think about that constant bearing direction, well, the risk of a collision, the risk of an upcoming collision corresponds to how much that angle is changing, okay? So if the bearing direction is constant, if it's not changing, you're on a collision course. If it's changing just a little bit, it's a high risk situation. If it's changing quite a bit, then you're gonna miss a collision, okay? So that's a visually available variable. The other variable is the imminence of collision. Well, I might be on a collision course, but it might not happen, for 6 weeks, okay? So I want to know how imminent this collision is, whether I need to avoid it. And so one source of information for that is the optical expansion of the target. So as the collision gets closer and closer, the visual angle of the target gets bigger and bigger, and so the rate of optical expansion also increases as you get closer. So the rate of expansion is an indicator of the imminence of collision, and as the expansion rate gets very large, you're about to hit the obstacle. So we can use these two variables in our control system. So now we're going to use a repulsion term again, but now we're being repelled away from that collision point, right? We're being repelled away from a constant bearing. And we're going to use this optical expansion rate as a way of deciding when to start responding to the obstacle. So at some value, right, we're going to start responding, and then it'll maximize at some value, and we'll at the value of 1. So here are the equations. I'm not going to try to go through them in any detail. They're components that correspond to the risk of collision with that psi dot variable, the imminence of collision with that theta dot variable, and the same for controlling speed, okay? So we've got very parallel sorts of equations, but they're controlling both our steering and our speed, whether we steer ahead and speed up or steer behind and slow down. So I can demonstrate these variables in these videos, and the question for the audience is, are you going to collide with this obstacle, or are you going to miss it? So here's one, collision or miss? Miss, yeah, you're going behind it. Okay, how about this one? Collision, right? Okay, so, and that's defined by the relative motion between you and the obstacle. Okay, so you can both be moving, right? And yet this expansion is going to be heading directly at you, and that expansion rate is going to be increasing if you are on a collision course. Okay. So Joey Bai, took this problem and collected some data on people avoiding moving obstacles. So this is in VR. We have a moving obstacle appear at any one of these initial positions and angles, directions. The obstacles went at different speeds. So we kind of tried to map out some of the parameter space for obstacles. And the data looks something like this. So here are the conditions under which most people go ahead of the moving obstacle. It's coming in from the left in this way this data are plotted. So most of these paths are ahead, a few are behind. But as the obstacle moves faster, now most of the paths are behind and a few are ahead. Yeah.
I'm wondering, your obstacles in the VR setting,
yes,
they don't care about you, right? So your action doesn't affect the environment.
Yes, that's correct. They're on a fixed trajectory.
I mean, more realistic would be that they probably also try to avoid you, right?
If it's a human, yeah.
And so you could probably also take your model as it is and put it on your obstacles, and they would do the same.
We're answering that question right now. So we just collected data on two people avoiding each other, or one person being ignoring the other. Okay, and so I'll be able to tell you that answer in a month. But it's a good question. My bet is that it's very similar. The parameter values may be a little different. So here's our data, and now what we're going to do is just simulate this with the model, right? And so we're going to initialize our model with the human position and heading and speed at the onset of the trial, and then we're going to fit the model parameters to the data by minimizing the position error between the model and the human. So here's the participant's trajectory in red. The model might generate a trajectory like that, so we're minimizing position error at the same points in time. And we're also going to measure passing order, like did the model go ahead of the object like the subject did, or did the model go behind the object? And so that will be the passing order error. And so basically for the model that I didn't really describe to you, right, those equations in the previous slide, the minimum absolute error in this data is 14 centimeters. So that's like, from the middle of your head to your shoulder. So that's pretty good, okay? And the passing order was 90% correct. So the model went to the right side of the moving object as the human on most of the trials. Yes?
I was wondering if both humans were aware of each other, because I'm thinking if I go and I'm aware of this person I might bump into, but the person isn't, I would probably go behind.
So these were all done with a green pole. Okay? So it's a moving obstacle on a fixed trajectory. It's not responding to the subject at all. But we are now just collecting data where it's another human and they are responding to the subject.
It's a point of awareness and then kind of a power thing, who concedes first.
Yes, you could play that game. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, the model strongly predicts the initial conditions are going to determine this, right? Because if the bearing angle is changing in a positive direction, you're going to go ahead. If the bearing angle is changing in a negative direction, you're going to go behind. But give me a minute, because it's not that simple. So anyway, with a single obstacle, the model fits pretty well. And that's with a threshold on that optical expansion. So you don't go from the very beginning, you don't make a decision until that optical expansion rate gets high enough that a collision is imminent, right? And then whatever the conditions are at that point, you go right or left, or ahead or behind. Okay, an interesting point. A number of other experiments by Anne-Hélène Olivier and Julien Petre and their colleagues in Rennes, who are our collaborators, they collected what they called similar kinds of data where a human is passing on either an inanimate object or another human. And they always find when they plot the predicted passing distance, okay? So this is at each time during the approach, if both of us continue on the same trajectory, how close are we going to get? Okay, so that's the path, the predicted passing distance. And so what they find is there are adjustments initially, right? But the predicted passing distance stabilizes at a value a little bit under a meter, okay? And that's under all kinds of conditions, okay? And so that led them to a model that says, well, the subject must be, or the agent must be predicting the trajectory of the obstacle and its own trajectory and computing the minimum passing distance, because clearly this is a variable that's being controlled explicitly, right? So we do the same sort of analysis on our constant bearing, avoiding the constant bearing model, and we see the same thing, okay? The model stabilizes on a constant bearing, or sorry, a constant passing distance, a little under a meter, with doing no prediction at all, right? It's just minimizing change, or sorry, it's just increasing change in this bearing angle. And that ends up with a constant passing distance. Yeah.
So you might have already said it's the same speed, all the examples, yes?
No, these are different speeds. So the obstacles can move at different speeds. Yeah. And that sometimes determines whether you're going ahead or behind, right? The moving obstacle. Yeah.
Well,
yeah. So it's all this means is that you don't have to, that the sort of minimum passing distance, or sorry, minimum predicted passing distance falls out of this online model and doesn't have to be computed and predicted in advance in order to look like it's doing prediction. So this is a kind of anticipation without explicit prediction. Okay, so where we started out was with a large crowd of people, okay? And the question is, well, maybe will this single collision avoidance model, scale up to a whole crowd, okay? So will it allow me to solve that second problem of avoiding multiple collisions? And so Kira Viprek has been doing experiments kind of like this, where she generates a crowd of avatars crisscrossing their paths, and the human subject is walking through that crowd of avatars. And again, at this point, those avatars are on fixed trajectories, so they're not responding to the subject. And so, in this experiment, there are 8 avatars crisscrossing in different directions, all going 1 meter per second. And we just measured the trajectory of the subject through that crowd and then tried to simulate it. So here's a simulation of Joey's original model, the one I just described in the previous slide. This is a particular example where they got the passing order correct. So the data are the red trajectory and the model is the black trajectory. So not bad. And we call this, we're now combining components, right, of our original elementary behaviors for a component for every obstacle, right, and generating a trajectory. So now we're calling this the SCRUM model, the self-organized collective motion model, when we're now combining components to try to predict this collective behavior. And so with Joey's original model with a particular threshold, okay, at the beginning for a single obstacle, now the mean error was, mean absolute error was about a meter, okay, not as good as it was before. Passing order is a little worse, 86% correct. So it generalizes, but it's still missing about 1 out of every 8 obstacles, and we've got a higher position error because of that. It also, so Kira then reanalyzed her data and realized that in a crowd, people have a higher threshold. You don't start to avoid an obstacle until you're much closer to it, because you've got to keep doing this, okay, as you're moving through the crowd. And if you start too far ahead, everybody else is changing their positions. So by simply fitting a new threshold for the optical expansion rate, now the mean absolute error is down to 51 centimeters, so not bad. Passing order is 89% correct. And we're talking about 8 obstacles as opposed to just 1, and we're able to generalize pretty well to those cases. And it does improve the performance of the model by the delta BIC. Yes.
When you are saying, you said that as a human, all the information we get to avoid people are visual. When we have 8 people, it's not probable that we can see everyone because there are some interruptions because someone is behind somebody. So as humans, we would not be able to see all obstacles. So the model here and the human itself, there need to be differences. And have you tried to figure out how this works?
You anticipated my next slide.
Okay.
So, yeah, there's a lot of occlusion in here, right? And so it's very brief occlusion because people are crisscrossing, right? So that might not be a problem. There's some perceptual evidence that people do interpolate a trajectory behind an occluder for short periods of time. But let's look at that, right? So Kira asked, well, how many of these obstacles, the models is fitting all 8 models, they're sticking all 8 obstacles in at once, okay? But how many obstacles are people actually avoiding at one time, okay? So she looked at this by changing the model, okay? So what if she took away the threshold, so there's no threshold at all? Well, performance these are BIC values for the model fits, is pretty bad. But suppose we say, okay, I'm only gonna look at the next 2 upcoming collisions, right? The obstacles that will have the next 2 collision points. That's a little better. What if I just look at the next collision? Okay, 1 collision ahead. That's even better. But now what if I use Joey's threshold? So it's like any obstacle that's above the threshold, could be 1, could be 2, could be 3, that's significantly, or by BIC, delta BIC, better, right? And now we use Kira's revised threshold with just the optical expansion rate, and that's better still. Okay, so it looks like we are not avoiding all obstacles at once. We're just avoiding those obstacles that are above the expansion threshold. And that's a few, right? Depends on how dense the obstacles are. And similarly, passing accuracy does improve as well by with that threshold. So it looks like, it's not like, you could think of a model in which you go, oh, I'm just going to attend to the next collision and avoid that. That would be kind of a serial process. Or maybe I'm attending to the next 2 collisions. And in fact, Julian Petre has done some work on people fixating, and they do tend to fixate the next colliding object. But it looks like they're factoring in more than just one, right? So it's not about where you're fixating or attending. You've got some diffuse attention. It's more like a kind of collective attention, ensemble attention. So, okay. So wrapping up this part on the collision avoidance, so I think we have evidence that there is anticipation without prediction because we know the model is not predicting anything. So the online model reproduces the human collision avoidance data pretty well. It explains that passing distance, predicted passing distance without explicit prediction. And that individual collision model scales up to multiple obstacles with a couple of adjustments in the threshold. And it's doing all of this without omniscient knowledge or trajectory prediction at all. It's just kind of running on the fly as it's encountering one object or a few objects at a time. So let me switch now to another behavior, which is following another person. Okay, so here I'm walking, through the mall or subway station. Actually, this is Grand Central Station, I think, and I'm following somebody through this busy crowd. How do I do that? Okay. Well, it turns out that there are many, many models of this from the car following literature. Literally, there are a dozen models of how one car would follow another or one pedestrian would follow another. So Kevin Rio and Greg Doctor did some experiments on this. So we started out with 2 people, so a participant following a Confederate, and the Confederate would change speed or change their walking direction, and we tracked their head positions. And it kind of looked like the follower was roughly matching the speed of the leader, and it looked like the follower was kind of matching the heading direction of the leader. Okay, and so we published some analyses of that data, but there were some anomalies in that, right? So take the leader speeding up or slowing down. Okay, there was some weird distance effects or asymmetries. So if the leader is here and they slow down, okay, they expand in your field of view. Here we have that optical expansion variable again. Okay, and so here's the mean speed of the leader slowing down, and here's a model that follows that uses the optical expansion, it slows down. A behavioral model that just matches the speed also slows down. But compare that to when the leader speeds up, okay? So here's the target speeding up. The model that matches speed speeds up, but humans don't speed up that much, all right? They only speed up a little bit, and the optical expansion model only speeds up less. So what is this asymmetry about? It has to do with what's called Euclid's law, okay? Euclid's law of visual angle. So the visual angle of something is larger as it gets closer to you, okay? So if something moves closer to you, it gets larger, faster. And if that same object moves farther away, it gets smaller, but at a slower rate, okay? The rate of expansion gets higher and higher and higher as the object gets closer to you. And so there's this asymmetry in the optics, okay? The expansion rate is larger than the contraction rate when the object is moving away. And that accounts for this asymmetry that we're seeing in the data. Same thing if you're following a leader who turns left, right, nearby, that creates a large angular velocity in the field of view. Same leader 4 meters away, turns left by the same speed. It's a much smaller angular velocity. This is Euclid's law again, okay? So it's just trig, okay? But you get this distance effect here, right? So here is the leader changing their heading direction. And so the behavioral model and the visual model both change their heading direction, and the human is there. Did I say that wrong? Sorry. The black curve is the human data, okay? The blue curve is the visual model for speeding up, for slowing down, and this is the model for, I am now confused. What? Oh, that's the leader. I don't know. Anyway, there is an asymmetry. Oh, these are distances, sorry. This is for the 1 meter target, okay? The visual model and the behavioral model are behaving similarly, but with a target that's farther away now, okay, the visual model is reduced, whereas the behavioral model is still responding the same way it did when it was close up. Okay, if it's just matching the lateral speed. Okay, so this really does matter to the behavior, okay, and it's captured by a model that's based on the visual angles. All right, so now we can formulate some visual control laws for following. Okay, so here's an object that slows down. There's an optical expansion, or if it speeds up, an optical contraction. And the follower can accelerate or decelerate directly proportional to that optical expansion rate. We normalize it dividing by the visual angle because that adjusts for differences in the size of the leader. Okay, so it normalizes for the leader's size. So if you just cancel that optical expansion rate, we call that the relative rate of expansion, then you're going to be following the leader at approximately the right speed. And for heading control, same thing, leader turns left, that creates an angular velocity in your field of view. You just accelerate to cancel that angular velocity. All right, so beginning of control laws. So Joey Bai then did some experiments to test this, and I won't go in any great detail, but there are, in this case, he looked at 9 different models of following from the car following and pedestrian following literature. And basically, here's an example where you're measuring the distance between the follower and the leader over time. And here's the distance of the leader is close or mid-distance or farther away. And if the leader decelerates, the distance actually gets smaller. If the leader accelerates, the distance actually gets larger. People are not maintaining a constant distance from the leader. Similarly, speed is not being matched, okay? Because depending on the distance, you get different adjustments in speed. That's due to that, the kind of distance effect that I just mentioned. And so you put all this data through a model comparison, right, where you're computing the predicted trajectories and measuring the difference between the data and the model. And it turns out the relative rate of expansion model fits the data the best. There are large delta BIC values between this model and each of these successive models. And so the constant distance, the idea that you're keeping a constant distance from the leader does no better than a null model that doesn't respond at all in this case. What about size? So to look at whether it's just the simple expansion rate or the relative rate of expansion. This is a plot of the rate of expansion as a function of distance for objects that are different sizes, right? So a leader that's skinny or fat, right, generates different rates of expansion. But if you plot the relative rate of expansion, if you just divide expansion rate by the visual angle of the leader, now those curves are pretty much on top of each other. So you've controlled for different sizes of the leader. So the question is, if I now have a human subject follow these objects that are different sizes, will they be affected by the size of the object or not? Okay. And it turns out, so here's the speed of the follower on deceleration trials and acceleration trials, and the different curves are for different sized leaders. And there's no statistical difference between them. So we think this is pretty good evidence that people are relying on the relative rate of expansion rather than the simple rate of expansion to do this sort of following. And this is like it's a trivially simple model, right? I follow behind somebody to keep their visual angle constant, right? Whatever it is, right? I cancel the rate of change in that visual angle to try to keep it a constant value. And so again, this data, the relative rate of expansion model, fits better than any of the others. So I think this is the answer for these simple cases. And the evidence supports this relative rate of expansion. But if you've got objects of constant sizes, it's equivalent to just the rate of expansion itself. So I'm going to use that just to simplify my equations in what follows. Okay. Weird thing. Out of this optical expansion model, there's a really heavy nonlinearity in that signal, right? It decays with the inverse of the tangent of the visual angle, okay? And so if you think about people following each other in a line, there's something called the fundamental diagram, one of my favorite terms. It's only fundamental in this little weird pedestrian modeling literature, okay? But it happens all over the place. So this is one way of representing it. So as the density of the crowd increases, so if you do an experiment where people are walking around in a big circle following each other, and you vary the density, the number of people per meter, as the density increases, the flow rate, which is the number of people passing a point per second, okay? At first, the flow rate increases because you just have more people, okay? But then it starts to decrease again, okay? And that's because the speed starts to decrease as density increases. People slow down as they get closer to each other. So why the heck would that be? Well, if you think about people far apart like this, little changes in the speed of the person in front of you creates a small effect in the visual angle. But now if you're, so here's one way of representing the fundamental diagram from Weidemann 1993, which is an attempt to kind of estimate that curve, okay? And if we take our following model, this is work ongoing by Antoine Tourdeau and Armin Seyfried, so I shouldn't be saying this, but this is just kind of preliminary cool thing. So Antoine derived what the fundamental diagram would be for our model, and it looks just like, the theoretical, the hypothetical function. So if you imagine now people closer together, and the people in front of you are changing their speed, you have big changes in the visual angle. Okay, so people start to respond more in a higher density situation, which leads, as Antoine showed through simulation, the whole group to slow down. So it follows, the flow rate curve is very similar to what you see in the empirical data. So this is just beginning, we'll see where this goes, but it's one way of saying the theoretical basis for the fundamental diagram may have to do with this optical expansion rate. That's a big promise, okay, don't take that to the bank yet. So following doesn't only happen when you're right behind a leader, right? You're following people next to you or all around you. And so Greg Doctor generalized this kind of model to other leader positions, okay? So here we looked at if the leader is ahead of you, you can control your speed based on canceling change in the visual angle. But if the leader is next to you and they change their speed, well, that creates an angular velocity next to me. Okay, in front of me, it's an optical expansion. Next to me, it's an angular velocity. And so you can write a control law now that changes that the follower's acceleration depends on the combination of their optical expansion and their angular velocity contingent on beta, which is the eccentricity relative to your heading direction, okay? So it goes from pure expansion, if beta is 0, to pure angular velocity if the angle is 90 degrees, okay? What about, that's for controlling your speed. What about controlling your steering, all right? Interestingly, it flips, okay? So now if I'm following a leader and they turn left, that creates an angular velocity to my left, and so I want to turn to cancel that angular velocity. On the other hand, if somebody's next to me and they turn left, that creates an optical expansion in my field of view, and so I want to cancel that optical expansion. And so the control laws for heading are just, you exchange the sine for cosine in these two equations, and you got the same equations for controlling speed and controlling heading based on the same two variables, right? This optical expansion rate and this angular velocity. So it's pretty simple in the end, although it looks horrific when you try to write it into an equation. And so the question is, does it work? So Greg did some experiments where, again, here you're in VR and you're following a single pole, and the pole could expand, okay, while you're following it. So that creates an artificial optical expansion. Or the pole could shift leftward, okay, while you're following it. And that would create an angular velocity. And so he did manipulated those two variables with objects in different distances and in different eccentricities, right, from the follower's walking direction. And, so you can perturb expansion, which simulates, in this case, a change in the leader's speed, or perturb angular velocity, which simulates a change in the leader's heading. And so this is the kind of data that you get. So here are the mean speed responses averaged over all the different positions, okay? And so what you see is the human data is the shaded curves. The visual model that I just had on the previous slide are the dashed lines. So for a target far away, target close up 1 meter, you get a large change in speed regardless of where they are next in space. And with a target farther away at 4 meters, you get a smaller change in speed, whereas the omniscient model that matches the leader's speed and heading direction responds the same regardless of distance. Similarly for steering, for heading responses, right, the model's heading responses are right in the zone of the human 95% confidence intervals. So it looks like in both cases responses are decreasing with distance thanks to Euclid's law, and those effects are captured by the visual model. If you now fit the data to both models, the visual model and the omniscient model that just matches the leader's speed and heading, you get these are RMS errors now, are better for the lower for the visual model than the omniscient model, and again for heading also lower for the visual model. So visual model is just fitting the data better than a model that assumes you know the velocity and position of the leader. Okay, so that gets us to collective motion in the 5 minutes that remain, but I don't know, we'll see if we can do this. Okay, so now, what happens if you're walking with a large group, okay, or if you're in a flock of birds? There are traditionally two ways of thinking about this problem. There's the rules of interaction, which is how is each bird responding to the other bird, and the neighborhood of interaction, which is the region over which I'm responding to my neighbors. And traditional models are kind of zonal models like this, where say you're a bird in the flock and you're going to be repelled from nearby birds to avoid collisions. You're going to align your velocity vector with birds in an intermediate zone, and you're going to be attracted to birds in a far zone to keep the flock together. Okay, so there are many versions of that kind of model. So you've got these sort of repulsion, alignment, and attraction forces, okay, at work, which are kind of metaphorical. They're kind of a phenomenological description that you can write into a model. But we now have visual control laws, and maybe we can substitute the visual control laws for those forces and see how that behaves. The neighborhood of interaction here is kind of omniscient knowledge, right? I know the positions and velocities of all the birds in this metric region of space. But maybe we can think about this in terms of a visual neighborhood, right? The visual terms. And I'm looking at Pavel because he's also measured this, right, in various models and simulated the effects of these kinds of neighborhoods. There is a tradition of synthetic vision or cognitive heuristic models, which do consider the optical variables in different ways. I think we have the virtue of actually having done experiments with humans to kind of derive what these optical variables might be. Okay, so we've got a hypothesis about those rules of interaction from our control laws for following. But we want to ask this question about the neighborhood of interaction. Okay, so if you're in a crowd, who is influencing who, right? Who's influencing you as you're walking around in a crowd? And so we've done a series of virtual crowd experiments where we put a human participant in the middle of a virtual crowd. So this is a binocular disparity display of walking with some avatars. And the participant is just instructed to walk with the crowd, right? Very vague, open instructions. And the trick is we do this in VR because we can perturb the motions of these avatars any way we want to. So as the crowd starts to walk, at some point, some subset of these avatars might turn 10 degrees to the right or the left, or speed up or slow down by 0.3 meters per second. And then we can measure the subject's responses to those small perturbations. And so what we're measuring here is the participant's head trajectory, and we recover their walking direction, their heading direction from that, and they make a turn in response to this perturbation, and then we measure the final heading after that stabilizes. Okay, so that's the basic paradigm. So one of our early experiments by Kevin Rio was, well, all these models assume that we're averaging all the motions of neighbors in a zone. Is that what we're doing? So in this experiment, we perturbed random neighbors, okay, just randomly anywhere between 0 or all 12 avatars in the crowd, and plotted the steering responses. This is the lateral deviation of the subject. And as you perturb more and more of the 12 neighbors, you get a linear increase in the response. Okay? So it very much looks like a kind of averaging response to all of the neighbors, which is consistent with this superposition idea that your response to a group of neighbors is just the sum of your response to those individual neighbors. And we see the same thing for speed, right? So if some subset of neighbors speeds up, your speed response increases linearly as more and more neighbors are changing their speed. Okay, so looks like we're averaging over a neighborhood. That's what that suggests. But there are some models that assume that you're just averaging all the neighbors equally, and there are other models that assume that maybe there's a distance dependence to the influence of a neighbor. And so we measured that by collecting some real crowd or fake crowd data. Here is a group of people walking around in the largest room we could find with 16 motion capture cameras around the circle. And this is what the data look like. It does kind of look like a flock of birds in slow motion, right? It's kind of cool. So the instructions here were like, walk around the room, veer randomly left and right, and stay together. And just keep doing that for 2 minutes. And so that gave us a bunch of data. We had 3 different groups of subjects of somewhat different sizes. We tried to manipulate their densities at the start of each trial. And then we could go in and measure the relations between these agents. So the thing I want to highlight, this is the heat map of the difference in heading direction. It is difference in walking direction between pairs of people in the crowd relative to, so it's the person in the center of mass of the crowd compared to all of the other individuals over all, in this case, 6 minutes of data. And so the heat map says, basically the difference in heading between the person in the center of the group and their neighbors is very low for neighbors within about, a meter. It starts to get higher, the green zone, and then by the time you're 4 meters away, you've got a 40-degree difference on average between your heading direction and your neighbor's heading direction. So it looks like the influence is much stronger for closer neighbors than farther neighbors. And we can plot that as a coupling strength, which is just the scale difference between these, 1 minus the scale difference. So we have a scale from 0 to 1, and that has a kind of exponential decay to it. And so here's a model for how the influence of your neighbors decreases as a function of distance. So we can have a distance weight. So that gives us, a kind of omniscient model that we could use where, and this is similar to many of those other zonal models, which is, okay, here's your heading. You're basically just controlling your steering toward, matching the heading direction of your neighbors, and summing up the average and weighting each neighbor by their distance. And the same thing for speed, you're just responding to the average, the difference between your speed and the speed of every neighbor weighted by their distance and taking that average. And so this would indicate a kind of weighted neighborhood, right? Weighted average over a neighborhood that's going to decay. And in our data, it decayed to 0 by about 4 meters. Okay, so that's one model. But now we could say, okay, we remember our visual control laws? Well, we could just substitute those visual control laws into that equation, okay? So here are those control laws for, this is for speed control, this is for steering control, and it's based on the optical expansion and angular velocities of each neighbor. But as somebody pointed out, occlusion is a factor, right? So if you're walking with a group, other neighbors might be hidden behind neighbors that are closer to you for extended periods of time. And so Greg did an experiment to test that, right? When you're in a crowd, you can't see everybody equally. And so you get this sort of partial occlusion to varying degrees, sometimes complete occlusion. And so Greg did an experiment where we manipulated the visibility of, so there are 2 rows of avatars. We manipulated the visibility of the far row of avatars. So they could be fully visible, right? Or they could be as occluded as we could make them. And of course, once the trial begins, people start walking. And so, you can't maintain exactly these conditions forever, but you can manipulate the initial conditions. And what Greg found is that the final heading, if the far row, so in this case, the near row turned, okay, and the far row didn't. And so the response is less if the far row is visible, and the response is greater to these near neighbors if the far row is occluded, okay? So those far neighbors are influencing your response, and if they're occluded, they influence it much less. And he fit his data to say that, basically it's directly proportional to the visibility of each neighbor with a threshold of like 15%. Once there's less than 15% of a person visible, then basically they don't influence you anymore. So that gives us a visual model, okay? So now we can say, okay, now I've got a neighborhood. I'm only responding to the visible neighbors I can see in proportion to their visibility. And I'm going to replace that within the sum here. I'm taking the average now of the optical motions that we had in our visual control laws. And there's no distance term in here because distance is just due to Euclid's law, right? The effects of distance are due to Euclid's law and to effects of occlusion. So the weight here is based on the visibility, right? Which is the 1 minus the occlusion of each of these neighbors. So there's, no more distance term. So I'm going to run through this experiment where we could say, okay, let's test this idea. Maybe this is a visual neighborhood now. It's not a metric neighborhood anymore. And so we had 3 rows of avatars in this display. We manipulated the distance of the whole group, okay? So you should see the effect of Euclid's law in responses to the near row, okay? Because that near row is getting farther away. And you should see the effects of occlusion in responses to the middle and far row, right? Because as they're more and more occluded, their perturbation should influence you less. And that's indeed what we see. So here's the mean final heading of the subjects as a function of the distance to the row that's perturbed. Okay, so in this green one, the near row was at 2 meters, the middle row was at 4 meters, and the far row was at 6 meters. And you can see that the occluded row really falls off dramatically, the middle row and the far row. Now you move the whole crowd out, so now the near row is at 4 meters, middle row is at 6 meters, far row is at 8 meters, and you see the same pattern. And the same pattern again when the near row is 6. But look, you also see the effects of Euclid's law, right? As the near row gets farther away, their influence on the follower, on the subject is less. Okay? And that's because their optical motions are decreasing with distance. So we can observe these two different decay rates. This gradual decay to the first row is due to Euclid's law, and the rapid decay within each crowd is due to the additional effects of occlusion. So we now simulate this data with the visual model and with our omniscient model, and the visual model is the dotted line, okay, and that's pretty close, okay, in the three conditions. The omniscient model is the dashed line, and it really underestimates the effects of occlusion. So I think there's evidence that the visual model is fitting the data better than the assumption that you see the speeds and directions of motion of all of your neighbors. We can now do multi-agent simulation. So if this is a good model, it should generate collective motion, right? If we simulate a bunch of agents. So here's Ben Falande's simulations, and this is 100 agents on a torus with a wide initial range of headings, and they all converge to a common heading. So we get collective motion out of that. Here's the phase diagram over the whole range of parameters that we looked at. So here's the interpersonal distance. Here's the initial range of heading in the whole crowd. And so it converges to ordered flocking if you're close enough, right? You've got strong interactions. And you start to get clusters forming if you have weak interactions at larger interpersonal distances. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So what excites me about this is that the sort of metaphorical forces in other models actually reduce to this visual coupling that we've described, right? So repulsion is affected by canceling optical expansion, right? So you avoid colliding with somebody by canceling their expansion. Attraction, right, that alignment, or the attraction to the far zone is implemented by canceling optical contraction. So if neighbors are moving farther away, you try to cancel that optical contraction. The alignment is the combination of canceling expansion and canceling angular velocity that leads to the collective motion. And so the neighborhood of interaction here isn't, a metric neighborhood or what sometimes we call the topological neighborhood. It's really due to the visibility of your neighbors and the amplitudes of their motion. All right, so I could stop or I could do one more. This is really the payoff. Should I do one more?
Yeah.
Okay, here's the payoff. So now, a number of years ago, I was on sabbatical in Julien Petré's lab, and we collected a bunch of data on crossing flows, okay? So these are two groups that are walking through each other. Okay? And this happens at intersections in busy cities or a class change on a college campus. There are always people, I'm trying to get from my parking lot to my office, and I'm always walking through these crossing flows of people on sidewalks. And so what's interesting is that you get it's been well known that if you have two groups passing through each other like this, you get lanes forming, like we saw in Shibuya Crossing. But you also get stripes forming when they cross at other angles. So here's an example of our data, animated. And so you see these stripes forming as they pass through each other. And it turns out that we tested a whole bunch of different crossing angles from 30 degrees to 180 degrees. So here's the direction of this group, here's the direction of that group. The stripes form perpendicular to the bisectrix of that angle. Why is that, right? So it's true for every crossing angle, right? The stripes are always forming perpendicular to the mean velocity, okay, of the two groups. And so Julian and I kind of had a bet about what would account for this stripe formation. And he said, it's just collision avoidance, that'll do it. And I said, no, I think you have to have alignment as well. And so we could now that we have a model of collision avoidance, we can test this. And so in this data, the instructions were very vague, just walk across the room and avoid running into your other people. And so I now have to get out of here because this animation always screws up. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a simulation of the human data and a simulation of our model that just has a goal, the other side of the room, and collision avoidance, okay? And these edges here are indicating, it's called an edge cutting algorithm. So it indicates when the two groups pass through each other, those edges get cut. And the edges that remain form the stripes, okay? Because they're not walking between those people. So let me quickly find this. Oh, I'm over here. And now I'm over here. Oh, I wonder if this is going to show. Haha.
You can move it right. So right. That screen is to the right side.
Yeah, so maybe I can slide this over. Okay, there's the human data. You can see the edge cutting is revealing the stripes, okay? This is a 60-degree crossing angle. And I think, yeah, we're gonna do that again. Oh, and this is the model, okay. There you go. So they're very similar, and if I could show you side by side, right, they're very similar edges that get, or stripes that get produced by those two. And so, where's my mouse? There it is. So essentially, we find the lanes and stripes are emerging from the local interactions with just collision avoidance, right? You don't have to be following, in addition to that, in order to generate these stripes. So that's an interesting result alone by itself. So here's the mean stripe orientation in the human data is the blue bars, and in our visual scrum model is in the red bars. So you see they're all lining up in this 90-degree orientation to the mean direction of the velocities. However, there's more variability in our simulation of, so this is the standard deviation in heading along a trajectory. So how much deviation is happening in the model compared to the humans. So here's the human standard deviation of heading along a trajectory. And here's the model standard deviation. It's higher than the human. So the model is doing more steering than the humans are. And vice versa, the model is doing less speed adjustment than the humans are. So we don't quite know why this is. We're trying to simulate that now. I think it might have something to do with mutual collision avoidance. So we used our single collision avoidance model here. And so we're going to see if we get mutual collision avoidance if this looks different. And so we're in the middle of that now. It's interesting that adding an alignment term, so you're aligning with the people in your own group, not just avoiding collisions with the people in the other group, also gets the standard deviations a little closer to the human data. So there may be a role for alignment, right, in understanding this behavior as well. Okay, so now I will stop. And I'm arguing here that collective behavior emerges from these local visual interactions between pedestrians. Information is sufficient to guide pedestrian behavior. So far, we haven't found a need to introduce predictive models or trajectory estimators. Online control is sufficient to get this kind of anticipation without explicit prediction. We get adaptive behavior without assuming that you construct an internal model of the entire scene. And that visual model scales up from individual pedestrian behavior to account for crowd behavior, including these various examples that we just went through. So I want to argue that pedestrian behavior is self-organized, which is kind of implied by this idea of emergence. So where individual trajectories of pedestrians emerge from the behavioral dynamics, or interactions with objects and goals and obstacles. And the global patterns of crowd behavior emerge from the collective dynamics when you put all of those local interactions together. So, and that's it. We have all of 10 minutes for questions.